Breaking tonight. In a razor-thin 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court of the United States has delivered a ruling that could dramatically reshape the future of assault weapon bans across America. And within hours, the United States Department of Justice signaled it is preparing major legal action. In a sharply divided 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that broad prohibitions on commonly owned semi-automatic rifles must meet a far more demanding constitutional test than many lower courts had previously applied. Writing for the majority, the justices said that when a firearm is widely possessed by law-abiding citizens for lawful purposes, such as self-defense, government bans face heightened scrutiny under the Second Amendment. The opinion emphasized that the Constitution protects arms that are in common use and that courts must evaluate modern gun regulations through a historical lens, asking whether similar restrictions existed at the time of the nation's founding. The majority reasoned that if a class of weapons is commonly owned today, that widespread ownership itself is strong evidence of constitutional protection. In practical terms, that makes categorical bans on certain semi-automatic rifles legally vulnerable because millions are currently in civilian circulation. The court did not say all firearm regulations are unconstitutional, but it made clear that sweeping prohibitions require strong historical justification, not simply modern public safety arguments. The three dissenting justices sharply disagreed. They argued that the majority's approach constrains lawmakers' ability to respond to contemporary gun violence and ignores significant technological differences between 18th-century firearms and modern rifles. The dissent warned that tying constitutional analysis so closely to historical analogs could limit democratic flexibility in addressing evolving threats. Ultimately, the ruling clarifies that future Second Amendment challenges will hinge less on balancing public safety interests and more on whether governments can point to historical precedents for similar firearm restrictions. That shift in legal reasoning is what gives this decision its far-reaching impact. The court's ruling makes assault weapon bans legally vulnerable because it reinforces a strict historical test for evaluating firearm regulations under the Second Amendment. Under this framework, governments must demonstrate that a modern restriction is consistent with the nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation, particularly around the time of the founding. That is a high bar for laws targeting semi-automatic rifles, which are modern inventions with no direct 18th-century equivalent. In practical terms, many state-level assault weapon bans prohibit firearms based on specific features, such as detachable magazines, pistol grips, or adjustable stocks, rather than banning all semi-automatic weapons outright. Courts must now ask whether there were comparable historical restrictions on weapons commonly possessed by civilians for lawful purposes. Because semi-automatic rifles are owned by millions of Americans, challengers argue they qualify as firearms in common use, a category the court has repeatedly said receives strong constitutional protection. This legal standard shifts the burden onto states to justify their bans with clear historical analogs. Public safety concerns alone are no longer sufficient. Lawmakers must point to similar regulatory traditions from early American history. That is where many modern assault weapon bans may struggle. Unlike long-standing restrictions on concealed carry or regulations on particularly dangerous or unusual weapons, broad prohibitions on an entire class of commonly owned firearms lack direct historical parallels. As a result, ongoing lawsuits in multiple states are likely to intensify. Lower courts that previously upheld assault weapon bans under more flexible balancing tests must now reevaluate those decisions using this stricter historical approach. While some bans could survive if judges find persuasive historical comparisons, the ruling undeniably creates a more challenging legal environment for states seeking to defend sweeping firearm prohibitions moving forward. Following the 6-3 ruling by the Supreme Court of the United States Department of Justice moved quickly to assess the legal and strategic fallout. When the court clarifies or reshapes a constitutional standard, it immediately affects how federal attorneys handle ongoing litigation. In this case, the DOJ must now reevaluate pending cases involving federal firearm regulations and decide how to defend them under the court's reinforced historical framework. One immediate task for the department is reviewing cases currently working their way through lower courts. If federal policies are being challenged, government lawyers may need to revise their arguments to align with the court's emphasis on historical precedent rather than modern public safety justifications alone. That could mean presenting more detailed historical research to support certain regulations, or narrowing the scope of legal defenses to focus on specific firearm features instead of broad categories. The DOJ also has the authority to issue updated guidance to U.S. attorneys nationwide. Such guidance can shape how aggressively prosecutors pursue firearm-related cases and which statutes receive priority enforcement. While the ruling does not eliminate federal gun laws, it may influence how they are interpreted and applied in court. Another possible avenue involves defending regulations that target accessories, modifications, or conduct, rather than outright bans on entire classes of firearms. By focusing on narrower regulatory approaches, the department may attempt to preserve certain safety measures while staying within the boundaries outlined by the court. Overall, the DOJ's response will likely be calculated and incremental, balancing constitutional constraints with the administration's policy goals. The agency's next steps could significantly influence how this ruling plays out in practice across federal and state court systems. The ruling does not automatically invalidate every existing assault weapon ban across the country, but it fundamentally changes how those laws will be evaluated in court. That distinction is critical. When the Supreme Court of the United States issues a constitutional decision clarifying the legal standard, it does not typically strike down all related laws nationwide unless they were directly before the court. Instead, the decision sets a binding framework that lower courts must apply when reviewing similar cases. For states that already enforce assault weapon bans, this means their laws remain in effect for now. However, they are far more likely to face renewed legal challenges. Plaintiffs who previously lost in lower courts may seek reconsideration, arguing that earlier rulings relied on outdated legal tests that no longer apply. In some cases, appellate courts may send lawsuits back to district courts for fresh analysis under the newly emphasized historical standard. The outcome will vary state by state. Judges will examine whether each specific ban can be justified by historical analogs, regulations from the founding era that are sufficiently similar in purpose and scope. Some states may attempt to argue that restrictions on especially dangerous weapons in early American history provide a foundation for modern bans. Others may struggle to identify close historical comparisons for prohibitions on widely owned semi-automatic rifles. This process could take months or even years as cases move through appeals and potentially return to the Supreme Court. During that time, enforcement may continue unless a court issues an injunction. The broader impact is a likely wave of litigation nationwide, creating legal uncertainty and potentially leading to a patchwork of differing rulings until higher courts provide further clarification. The political consequences of this ruling are immediate and far-reaching. In Washington, debates over gun policy were already deeply polarized, and a 6-3 decision from the Supreme Court of the United States only intensifies that divide. Lawmakers who support expansive Second Amendment protections view the decision as a reaffirmation of constitutional limits on government power. They argue that elected officials cannot bypass fundamental rights, even in response to public safety concerns. For them, the ruling strengthens the argument that broad assault weapon bans overstep constitutional boundaries. On the other side, lawmakers who advocate for stricter gun control measures see the decision as a significant setback. They contend that modern firearms differ dramatically from those available at the time of the nation's founding, and that tying regulation to historical analogs makes it harder to address contemporary gun violence. Many are now calling for alternative legislative approaches, including narrower regulations focused on background checks, red flag laws, or firearm storage requirements that may better withstand constitutional scrutiny. In Congress, the path forward is complicated. Any new federal legislation targeting semi-automatic rifles would now need to be crafted carefully to survive judicial review under the court's clarified framework. That likely means avoiding sweeping categorical bans and instead pursuing incremental policies that can be defended using historical precedent. However, given the current political balance, passing major new gun legislation remains challenging. Beyond Capitol Hill, the ruling is likely to energize advocacy groups on both sides of the issue. Fundraising, campaign messaging, and upcoming elections could all reflect heightened attention to judicial appointments and constitutional interpretation. Ultimately, the decision not only reshapes legal doctrine but also amplifies the broader political struggle over gun policy in the United States. Beyond the immediate debate over assault weapon bans, this 6-3 decision signals a deeper constitutional shift in how courts interpret the Second Amendment. The Supreme Court of the United States has reinforced a method of analysis that places historical tradition at the center of constitutional review. Rather than weighing modern policy arguments or balancing public safety concerns against individual rights, judges are now directed to ask a more specific question. Does a challenged regulation align with the nation's historical understanding of firearm restrictions? That approach narrows the flexibility lawmakers once had when crafting new gun regulations. In earlier years, many courts applied interest-balancing tests, allowing governments to justify restrictions by demonstrating a substantial public safety benefit. Under the strengthened historical framework, those policy arguments carry less weight unless they are supported by comparable examples from early American history. This marks a significant evolution in Second Amendment jurisprudence and limits the ability of courts to uphold innovative or broad regulatory measures without clear historical backing. The broader implication is that future firearm cases, whether involving magazine capacity limits, licensing requirements, or restrictions on certain accessories, will likely be decided through this same lens. Lower courts across the country must now align their rulings with the Supreme Court's directive, creating a more uniform but also more historically anchored legal standard. In practical terms, this means constitutional debates over gun policy will increasingly turn into disputes among historians, legal scholars, and judges over the meaning of 18th and 19th century firearm practices. The decision therefore reshapes not just one category of law, but the entire trajectory of how gun regulations are analyzed, defended, and challenged in the American legal system. So what's next? Expect immediate legal challenges, aggressive state-level defenses, and a renewed national debate over the balance between public safety and constitutional rights. This 6-3 decision may not be the final word, but it is a major turning point in the fight over assault weapon bans in America. Stay tuned.